Good evening, everyone. I'd first like to start by welcoming Mr. Anirudh Krishnan back to Nalsar. By the time he had graduated from here, he'd already published a book on the laws of reservation and anti-discrimination, so we've all got a bit of catching up to do. Right, so post Nalsar, Mr. Krishnan went on to earn his BCL from Oxford and was also an editor of Justice Bachwat's Law of Arbitration and Conciliation, a foremost authority on the subject area. During his time at Clifford & Chance, he was a part of their commercial litigation and arbitration team. And also back home, he was appointed for the consultant as for the Law Commission Report of India, and he has worked with them continuously throughout the years on the subject area of arbitration. Mr. Krishnan is also a founding member of AK Law Chambers, the leading commercial litigation firm in Chennai. So without any further delays and without any ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Krishnan to take over the podium.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It feels great to be back. I'm here after about 5 or 6 years. I'd come to judge a moot about 5 or 6 years ago, but it's been a really long time. And it's not, it's almost on an everyday basis that I recollect what I did at Nalsar and what I learned, because you would appreciate the true value of what you've learned here when you start applying it in practice. Nalsar provides you the perfect tools required for the hunt being the practice of law. I'm also very happy to see that there is a forum such as the Nyaya Forum, which is meant for encouraging litigation. When I graduated in 2008, about 90% of the lawyers joined law firms and went into transactional work. Maybe about 5% of us entered litigation and 5% entered academics and human rights. The third category, I'm not even going to endeavor to try and convince you into joining litigation, because I think a human rights lawyer and an academician does a lot more to society than we commercial dispute resolution lawyers. But my endeavor today is to try and convince those of you who don't have a fair idea about how the commercial dispute resolution practice works and what it entails, and those of you who, as of today, would perhaps prefer to become a transactional lawyer, to at least consider a career in commercial dispute resolution. Success, to a large extent, is based on being at the right place at the right time. Sometimes that happens by chance, and sometimes it happens by choice. It appears to me that Nyaya is a forum that persuades students to choose the latter option. Today there is certainly a wave for commercial dispute resolution in the country, and this is the best time to ride the wave. With legislations such as the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code that was enacted in 2016 and the recent amendments to the Arbitration Act, with the short timelines involved in commercial dispute resolution by virtue of these amendments and the Insolvency Code, today there is enough and more work in this space, and therefore this is perhaps the best time to enter this space. Let me start off by recollecting some of my experiences when I joined Clifford Chance and started off doing transactional work. Prior to joining Clifford Chance, I had always wanted to be a litigating lawyer. Therefore, I always had this bias towards litigation. But then when Clifford Chance came down to India and recruited for the first time, it was the cool thing to do to just apply, and with a Clifford Chance job, it was a difficult choice to say no at that point. So I accepted it, I took up the offer and thought, let me see how it goes, let me not go there with a closed mind. But 1 month into doing corporate transactional work, I realized that this is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to litigate, and that was very, very clear. That got reinforced during my stint as part of the arbitration practice in Clifford Chance. But at the end of 2 years, I felt it was time to move on. A lot of people ask me, why did you not like the work? Why did you come back to India? My answer is simple. If you want to be a super specialist in the field of arbitration, then you need to stay on in a foreign law firm till you make it to a partner, or you change locally, or you can look at becoming a barrister. But I loved advocacy, and there is no place like India to get very good advocacy exposure. Further, considering that I wanted to be a generalist in the field of commercial dispute resolution and not a super specialist in the field of arbitration, India was always a better place. When I talk about super specialization, in a firm such as Clifford Chance, you would have a team that works only on oil rigs arbitration. You would have identical contracts, therefore disputes are also of almost an identical nature. So at some point of time, you start getting bored of that kind of work. When you look at, say, a partner at Clifford Chance, they would possibly be handling 3 to 4 arbitrations at a time at a super specialized level. You look at practicing in India, you have 7 cases a day in court. So the variety that you have in India is something phenomenal. So therefore, Clifford Chance and a foreign law firm did not fit the larger scheme of things so far as I was concerned. Considering that my long-term goal was to come back and become an advocate in India, I thought 2 years was more than enough. Because I learnt those crucial skills that a foreign law firm taught you, and I thought that 2 years was enough to learn those skills. What are these skills that I refer to? The first is the ability to handle large case files in a methodical manner without getting overawed by the situation. There was an arbitration that we worked on where there were perhaps 80 to 90 volumes. There was a wall like this, and throughout the case files were as large as this wall. So you had to prepare dates and events for those entire volumes, and they were not simple. They were all technical. It was a construction dispute, so you had files that set out how many laborers were at site on what days. You had somebody who had plotted the whole thing in a map, and you had a labor histogram. You had a critical path analysis that had been prepared by technical experts. All of this needed to be digested. What the foreign law firm experience helped me achieve is the ability to handle that kind of volume without being overawed. You handle one of those kind of cases, you can handle any number of them. The second crucial area where I benefited from the Clifford Chance experience is when it comes to drafting. Sometimes we tend to be a little loose when it comes to the language that we use. We tend to exaggerate in our pleadings. We tend to use a few too many words. At Clifford Chance, the first 1 year, I felt like tearing my hair out when the partner would correct every line of a draft that I would submit, even if it was a simple letter. There would be 2 extra words that would have been struck off, and he would tell me, you correct it, print it again and show it to me. At that time I would think, why can't he do it himself? It would possibly be much faster for him to just delete those 2 words and send out the draft. But 1 year into my stint I realized why this process was being followed. You automatically start being pickier with your words, and you learn to be precise in your drafting. This, I think, is an extremely important skill, because when a judge reads your pleadings, a first impression is formed. When a client reads your pleadings, a first impression is formed. Perhaps the client is not aware of the intricacies of the law, but the client expects the pleadings to convey a point. The client expects the pleadings to hit hard, and if that is achieved, then the client is going to be happy, and well, the client knows that best efforts have gone in. The third skill that I learnt is client management. Sometimes when we see foreign law firm partners speak to clients, you feel, why are they being so extra nice? Client management is an extremely important skill. You need to ensure that you meet your deadlines. You need to ensure that if something is not in order, you convey it in the proper way to your client. You don't want your client to just get a start. And in fact, I had an experience 2 days ago where I'm appearing in the National Company Law Tribunal in Madras, where there is a foreign law firm involved. The partner comes down for every hearing, and during the course of the hearing, I was of the view that the judge wanted an extra affidavit with some more details, and therefore the hearing didn't go on as per schedule. I sought some time because the clients were based in Europe. They had to sign the affidavit and send it back. Therefore, I requested for about a week to file that in. And thereafter, there were holidays. There are holidays coming up in the National Company Law Tribunal. The other side lawyer was traveling, and I was traveling. So therefore, the matter got pushed by a month. For an Indian litigator, a month is not a big deal. And considering that the matter had already gone on, I thought it was perfectly fine, and we agreed to the date and we went ahead. I came out, and then the English lawyer had elaborate discussions on how this must be conveyed to the client, because he was of the view that if I tell the client that the matter is posted on February 10th, the client is going to get a start. It struck me that perhaps there was something to what he said. So then I virtually broke down every 10-day period, and as to why the case could not be conducted in that 10-day period. And that additional affidavit that needed to be drafted as well, we worked on it overnight, prepared the draft, sent the email to the client along with the draft affidavit that needed to be finalized at the end of the client. So the client was then happy. Well, all the steps have been taken, and it's only because of reasons completely beyond everybody's control. This skill of client management is an often underrated skill, because you can't win every case. When you lose a case, if every client for whom you lose a case leaves you, you're not going to be having a good practice. That is a very important skill that a foreign law firm teaches. There were 3 skills: brevity in drafting, client management, and ability to handle voluminous case files without being overawed by the situation. For this, I was of the view that 2 years were enough. Further, I thought that if I get too used to the orderliness of the English system, it would be very difficult to adapt when you come back to India. And in hindsight, I think it was the timing was perfect, because I have seen a few others who stayed on for 2 more years who are not able to get used to surprises that are sprung by the other side in court in India. So with this, after completing this the stint at Clifford Chance, I thought I must also go to Oxford to complete my BCL and then come back to India. I am recounting these incidents because I am sure, as a student who is looking at commercial dispute resolution as a possible avenue, you are looking at possible steps that you need to take in the coming years, which would give you all the skill sets that are required to excel in this field. So I am often asked as to whether or not an LLM helps. I think it certainly does. But it's about what you're looking for in your LLM or your BCL. I was not interested in super specialization, and hence I did not, at that time Stanford had a course on arbitration with a lot of focus on bilateral investment treaty arbitration, but though I got an offer, I chose not to go there. I chose the BCL at Oxford over this. The primary reason is that the BCL teaches you the why of the law. There were two very important skills that I think I've picked up at Oxford, which today greatly helped me. The first is the ability to read a particular case law in 3 or 4 different ways. We had some phenomenal professors who would give you the reading material, expect you to read it, you would form a view. They would ask you for your view, and then they would argue the contra view. And that was just a phenomenal experience, because you realize that a single case law could be looked at from 3 or 4 different ways. And today, if the other side when faced with a situation in court relies on a case law, you should have the ability to use the same case law against the person. That is a critical skill. In fact, I am also reminded of the interpretation of statutes course at Nalsar, which was of a very similar nature. We were taught by the late Professor Vepasarathi and Professor Danda. And both of them come from the opposite schools of thought. And both of them, well, I'm sure you all had the pleasure and honor of being taught by Professor Danda. Both of them are very, very forceful in the manner in which they put forward their thoughts. So you had the first half where Professor Vepasarathi would come and stress on how what is important is the text of the law, and then you will have Professor Danda come and say you have to look at it from a sociological point of view. So from the very same case laws would be interpreted by both of them in opposing manners, and both would interpret them equally persuasively. That's the kind of skill set that you require. That's the kind of skill set that you require to succeed in litigation. The second area where I thought I greatly benefited from the BCL is understanding the why of the law. We had a course called Philosophical Foundations of Common Law, taught by Professor Gardner, who was a legend. In that course, the why behind contract law, tort law, and criminal law were addressed. I am not too concerned with criminal law, that's not the area I am now into. But when it comes to understanding contract law, for instance, today helps you when you have a case where the letter of the law is against you. You need something to fall back upon. And that's where legal theory behind the law comes in. So if you are able to convince a judge that this is the reason why the law was formed, this is the rationale behind the principle, therefore interpret the provision keeping in mind the rationale, then that gives a different perspective to the case. So while what this course presumed was that you know the basics of your law, and thankfully because of the courses at Nalsar, we were fairly well versed with the basics, and this skill greatly helped us. It was then time to come back to India and start my practice. I joined the chambers of Senior Counsel Mr. R. Murari for a year or so, and then I started off on my own. What is so special about dispute resolution in India? There are two aspects to it. The first is dealing with the merits of the case. These arguments on merits you would get in any jurisdiction. It's nothing that is peculiar to India. It's very fascinating, no doubt it's very fascinating, but when I'm talking about arguments on merits, I'm largely looking at final hearing cases in courts and hearings in arbitrations. And in this bracket I would also include trial work, cross-examination, which can be a lot of fun. That is one aspect of it. There is a second aspect of the Indian system that is very unique, that is often criticized, that is often quoted as being the frustrating part of litigation. But it all depends from which end of the prism you look at it. It is often said that India is a system where, the Indian system is one where there are adjournments, matters don't get heard, a civil suit takes 5 years to be decided, and then there's an appeal for another 5 years, and therefore things just prolong. If you look at it from the point of view as to how can I get relief for my client by beating the system, then the challenge becomes interesting. You know that if you spend 10 years filing a civil suit and you recover 20 crores from the other side after 10 years, your client is perhaps not even going to survive those 10 years. You need to look at what is commercially going to be the other side's weakness and how do you get to that weakness. If you are able to do that, then the system is not a frustrating system, but it provides you challenges that no other system would. Let me give you a few examples, a few case studies that I've been involved in that I found extremely exciting. Case study number 1. I got a call from the partner of Jones Day in London, saying that there has been an anti-arbitration injunction that has been issued by an Indian court restraining a London-seated arbitration from going ahead. And he gave me the brief facts. He told me that it was a case where there were 2 Indian parties, and the argument is that 2 Indian parties cannot have a foreign seat. And he also told me that there is a foreign parent who has not yet been implemented in the arbitration. So those were the bare facts. He said, would you be happy to handle it? I said, I'm certainly happy to. At that point, I didn't know any more details. Then I realized that the court that had granted this injunction was the Singrauli District Court. I don't know how many of you have heard of this place, Singrauli. I certainly hadn't till I had to literally Google map it. And when I Google mapped it, I realized that it was 2 flights and an 8-hour car drive away from Chennai. So it was literally quite a trek to get there. We would have to travel for about 1.5 days to get there and 1 day back. So 3 days would get knocked off in getting there. Whereas the other side would fly down in the Reliance chopper, land next to the district court, finish the case and fly back. So we realized at that point that if we fight this litigation in the traditional route, we are going to be stuck at Singrauli forever. The other side was represented by perhaps the biggest name in Madhya Pradesh, Mr. Vivek Tanka. It was a case which filed by Reliance in their stronghold in Singrauli. So everything was loaded against us. So we thought, well, let's try something different. Well, if it clicks, it clicks. If it fails, we've possibly lost 1 month in a 5-year process. It doesn't make a difference. So we said, instead of traditionally, when there's an injunction granted, you will file an application for vacating the injunction under Order 39 Rule 4. We found a Madhya Pradesh High Court judgment which said, instead of doing that, you can directly file an appeal. That was a stray judgment. It is arguable that stands impliedly overruled by a Supreme Court judgment. But arguable is the word. So we said, let us try out an appeal using this judgment. And if the judge gets into the merits, he will say, well, we don't even want to trouble you with the merits. Please just say that the district court must decide this matter within a period of 1 month. So we can go ahead. Anyway, the CPC prescribes 1 month for disposing of an Order 39 Rule 4 application. CPC prescribes it, but nobody ever follows it. So the CPC may provide justification for the High Court to set the timeline, and the District Court would follow the timeline set by the High Court, but the District Court by itself would not follow the CPC timeline. Luckily, it worked. So the High Court passed an order saying the appeal is not pressed, but a direction is issued for the District Court to decide the matter in 1 month. So we filed an application under Order 7, Rule 11. We filed an application under Section 45 of the Arbitration Act for referring the matter to foreign seated arbitration. We also filed an application under Order 39, Rule 4. And we told the judge, well, the direction may be for the Order 39, Rule 4 application, but you can't hear this piecemeal because the issues involved are the same. Therefore, hear the whole thing and finish it off in 30 days. That point, the other side, initially we had engaged a senior counsel in Madhya Pradesh. The other side wanted to play a few tricks, so the senior counsel had got into the train to come to the district court. The other side called them up and said that their senior counsel had a stomach upset and wanted a 25-day adjournment. And this, I was boarding the flight from Delhi to Varanasi to get to Singrauli when I heard this. When I heard that our senior counsel had consented to this. So I called up the clients. I said, well, I don't mind accommodating them for a week, but the High Court deadline ends in 20 days. So by us accepting a 25-day adjournment, we effectively waived the High Court timeline. So therefore, I spoke to the counsel in England who said, you do what you think is right. So I decided to go and argue the matter that day. I argued it. I said, well, if he has a stomach upset, I don't mind accommodating for a week. Let him come next week and complete it. Matter didn't end there because the 20-day deadline was breached. So we filed another appeal. And this time we told the High Court, well, the earlier High Court order was not complied with. So keep the appeal pending, give them 1 week and post the appeal on the 8th day. High Court agreed. So this time there was no way the district court could not decide the issue. The issue was decided in 7 days and thankfully we won. So arbitration in London could recommence. And then I think the rest of it flowed. We won at the High Court, we won at the Supreme Court, and arbitration. Within a year and a half, all 3 stages were crossed. I think the crucial bit over here was the first stage of getting the timeline set. That is not something that you would read on merits, but that was the way in which you had to get the system moving. If not, we would still be in Singrauli today. I will give you a second anecdote. And in fact, well, there was a project for construction of a desalination plant. My clients came to be terminated, and the clients came to me to file a money claim, and they wanted to know whether there were any other steps because they wanted to precipitate a settlement. The traditional route was go for your money claim, which we did independently. The second thing to do was to try and see how can I bring them into negotiation mode. A money claim is not going to bring them into negotiation mode. So what we did was we claimed that we had a copyright over those drawings that we had issued to them for the desalination plant, and that was fairly easy to establish. The contract did not contain a clause which transferred the copyright from us to them. Therefore, even if you terminated it, the copyright remains with us. And if the copyright remains with us, you can't use the drawings to proceed with the project. And if you can't use the drawings to proceed with the project, you will have to do the entire engineering again. And by the time that is done, the main employer would proceed against the other side. So this clicked at least to the extent that it brought them to the negotiating table. It's another aspect the negotiations failed. But that is another aspect where you need to, the traditional route would not have yielded you results. The negotiations may still succeed, at least the negotiations, as you are perhaps aware, are on and off at various points, and once they first negotiate, then there's a bit of softening during the process, and ultimately it's still an ongoing case. I will give you another anecdote on how you need to get around the system at times. there was a contract that had been entered into between a mid-sized Indian company and a global giant in the pharma industry. The global giant had made these people sign unfavorable terms. There was exclusive jurisdiction vested in courts somewhere in Europe, and it just was completely not feasible for these people to fight the battle along the traditional route. So they wanted to know, can we handle court? It was not even an arbitration proceeding in Europe. At least arbitration you can say that you can handle it from here, but you had to go to a court somewhere in Europe. So we said we'll try a different route. We had Googled and found out that global giant had recently merged, had just prior to the contract with us, merged with another big international company, and when you looked at their joint presence in India, you could argue that they would have a dominant position in the market. Those were the days when competition litigation was fairly new, and I think companies are still petrified of it, and it was more so then. It was just after the time when all these, we were fresh off a litigation for Nissan, where there were competition proceedings against all these car manufacturers, and all of them were, there was a 10% penalty that had been imposed upon them, and soon after that came the penalty on the cement industry. So with that background, most companies were petrified of the word breach of the Competition Act or violation of the Competition Act. So we sent a legal notice as to how this company, we set out the various breaches and said how, in addition to it being a breach of contract, this would also amount to an abuse of dominant position. And we had said that we would, in our next letter, the next letter we said would be issued directly to the Director General of the Competition Commission for investigation. If once it goes there, it's out of everybody's hands, because at that point the Director General was extremely enthusiastic and used to jump into these kind of things, and once you're stuck, it's a crazy amount of penalty under the Competition Act. They came around, matter settled within months. Otherwise we would have had to go to the European court, and we would have spent more than we would have recovered. So these are the kinds of incidents that make commercial dispute resolution a lot of fun, because it's about the way you look at the system. You can always say, well, the system is boring, I don't have enough, there are more adjournments than final arguments on a day-to-day basis. If you decide to make the system interesting for yourself, this is an absolutely fascinating system to be in. I can give you one more instance. Do I have the time, or let us do one thing? I'll probably come to this right at the end if there is time. I think because I also want a fair amount of time for question and answers. So, in order to make the most of this system, what are the key skill sets that you require? What is it that you need to focus on right from today to get to a place where you enjoy the system, where you thrive in the system, and where you can get best results for your clients? The first, well, I think this is, I don't want to be preaching, but I think the discipline is most important. You need your timetable, you need your daily deadlines, you need to meet those daily deadlines. That right from your stage of your college till whatever stage of practice. I still start off my day with where I write down in my daily board to what are the matters I'm going to finish for the day. There's a weekly list that is prepared, which the associates would come and they would also be appraised of, so they could ensure that their preparation is in time for me to review those matters. So that without that level of discipline, you are going to be missing out on a number of deadlines. The second is a solid foundation in the law. Whatever strategy that you come up with, you need some legal principle around which you can build that strategy. So for instance, if you are going to file a copyright infringement suit, you should know when the client may come to you with a pure contractual dispute, which according to the client is a pure contractual dispute. But you should know that there is this provision in the Copyright Act which gives me scope to initiate this kind of proceeding. You must know that there is this provision in the Competition Act which I can exploit. And then you can further research on it. That's a different issue. But you need that. So therefore you need to, and I think there the foundation from NALSAR greatly helped. The third is the ability to think a little out of the box. See, when a client comes to you with what seems to be a hopeless case, he is not coming to you expecting you to say, you have a hopeless case, please go back. He's not expecting you to say, well, we'll fight it, but you're going to lose 100%. In most cases, clients recognize the weaknesses in their case. They come to you for you to turn it around. So that attitude of how every case is winnable within obviously within the framework of the law is important. You need to be able to turn a case around purely based on a twist that you can give the case or a legal interpretation. But there is obviously a fair line to be drawn. There are people who cross the limit. So long as you say every representation of mine before a court will be fair, I will not mislead on any question of fact or any question of law, but I will do what I can do best for my client because at the end of the day, two interpretations are always possible. So ultimately, if there is a case that is dead against you, I would always suggest you cite the case and then try and distinguish it, rather than try and birth the case and hope that the other side is not going to produce it. The fourth important skill set is the ability to structure and present, for which I think you need to write. Write as many papers as you can. The project system greatly helps, because at the end of the day, you structure a piece of research and you present it to your class. At some level, that's the same as structuring an argument and presenting it to the judge. You need to take your project seriously. What I used to do was, I used to change my topic so it suited my interest. I used to find out some contentious issue in that area and then request my professor to allow me to change my project topic, and then try and convert that into a paper that I could later publish. So one, that helps you in your CV building, which I think today is essential if you're looking at a job in a foreign law firm or a foreign university. And second, this ability to structure and present is what ultimately helps you as a litigating lawyer. There is another reason why writing is extremely important. See, there are a number of restrictions that are placed on Indian lawyers in terms of your ability to advertise. Foreign law firms are permitted to solicit clients. A lot of the bigger Indian law firms are not permitted, but they decide to solicit clients. If you want to follow the rule book, and I believe that's important, you need to look at an avenue by which you can be known in the market and yet not act contrary to the Bar Council regulations. So your writing speaks for itself. So people read your article, they form opinions. That's the best way of advertising, according to me, in a perfectly legal manner. Before I conclude, let me address a couple of issues that sometimes tend to be trivialized. Firstly, procedural issues. A lot of people believe, well, I am not going to stitch the bundle, that's for the clerk to do. I don't care about the procedure, let the clerk manage the procedure. But unless you are on top of it, unless you know what are the procedures to be followed, unless during an emergency you can step in and stitch the bundle, you will never be able to regulate the clerk who's going to report to you when you have your own office. The clerks will tell you it is stuck with this person, the file is not moving, the file is stuck there, the file is not locatable. It is only if you have an idea of what the procedure is that you can tell him, well, why not this option of getting it? Or you tell him, well, I know how to handle it, I'll come with you tomorrow, and then the truth will come out. So, procedure is something that is trivialized, but procedure is extremely important. It can sometimes be painful. Waiting in the registry to get a suit numbered, especially in the Madras High Court, is the most difficult thing that I am told Andhra is far easier. But the Madras High Court registry is extremely strict. They will sometimes step into the judge's shoes. They will ask you for judgments to justify why the prayer can be granted. But you are able to, but it's an extremely important skill to master if you need to succeed in litigation in India. The second aspect is, it is often said that, well, don't go and litigate because there's no money in it. I agree that when you start off your career as a litigating lawyer, if you do not join one of the big firms, there is not as much money as in it as in transactional work. But that's only for the initial phase. You make it as a litigator in India, sky is the limit. So I don't think, but that said, I don't think you must be in a hurry to want to make that kind of money, which a lot of your friends who are doing transactional work would make, because the fact of the matter is for a few years you're not going to make that. But the minute it starts clicking, I think the strides that you take will be extremely rapid. The other issue that I would like to, that I'm often asked, which I'll conclude with that and then I'll take questions, is, do you super specialize in arbitration? Is it something that, can I tomorrow be a super specialist in international commercial arbitration and bilateral investment treaty arbitration? I think abroad there is certainly scope to super specialize, and there are firms like Three Crowns that do only arbitration. But the advantage of that is, well, 10 years down the line you're possibly going to be among the top few in the world in those fields. The disadvantage is that you will have to really wait it out before you get your advocacy opportunities. Can you super specialize in India in arbitration is the next issue. Slowly there is a trend towards that, and I see a number of people wanting to do that. But in my view, we are not yet there. I believe that in order to be able to give the best possible advice to your client, you need a bird's eye view of the entire system. Because we are not yet at a stage where courts take a completely hands-off approach. So you would have to know how a court is going to react when they see a particular award. You will have to know whether going to court prior to arbitration or simultaneously is going to grant your client better relief. Like for instance in the copyright matter, if there's an arbitration clause, you would, if you're a super specialist in arbitration, the copyright angle would not strike you. Sometimes there may be an arbitration clause, but you could construe a letter to be an admission and move the National Company Law Tribunal under the IBC. So there are options that are available, and today, unless you have an idea of the entire commercial dispute resolution sphere, you are not going to be able to give the best possible advice to your client. Therefore, I feel we are not yet there where you can do only arbitration and nothing else. Secondly, from a very practical point of view, you block 10 days to do an arbitration. The other side asks for an adjournment 1 week before that. Well, you would have kept yourself fully free for that period. If you don't have any court work, then you're going to be idling away. So the fact is, I think maybe 7-8 years from now, we would get there. We are in the process of getting there. But as of today, my recommendation would be look at commercial dispute resolution, that is arbitration plus company litigation plus IPR litigation, plus some general civil litigation, some amount of writ petitions and constitutional work. Look at this as a package. That would be my advice. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we have a mic to circulate.
Hi, I'm Sameer from the third year.
Hi.
So when we're talking to people about dispute resolution as a career, and specifically when we go to arbitration conferences and speak to people working in foreign firms, the constant argument we hear about not coming back is that unless your father is a lawyer, it's like the 3-year period will probably be a 7-year period. And like, at least in my experience interning at high courts, it does seem to be much harder to break in if you don't have an entry point at all. So, like, is that something that, like, would that circumstance make it a vastly different experience for people who don't have relatives or an into the legal system?
That's a very valid point that you're raising. I think there is certainly a 3-year edge that somebody with family has over you if you don't have family in litigation. But I think it's restricted to a 3-year edge, because what it primarily having family in litigation gives you some of those initial introductions to clients which you would not otherwise get. So it would give you more appearances during your first 3 years where you really don't have too much of other work. You at least have some appearances and some chances to impress others, and that's how ultimately it's all by, it says, okay, this person argues really well, refer the matter to him. There'll be a matter that goes to a senior counsel, and they say, okay, fine, this person really gets his research in place, let him be the briefing counsel, I'll argue it. So that's how it sort of picks up. So obviously with family there you have your initial introductions, but if you're good and you keep writing. I think I am coming back to writing, because writing makes you well known, right? That coupled with the few opportunities you get over the first 3 years, I think you can take off, notwithstanding the fact that you don't have a family background.
So just following up on that sort of, so during my internships, what I've heard from certain juniors in like junior counsel is that as a first generation lawyer, you'd be better off probably starting at a firm and doing like a assortment of work there, so that there, because usually the firm is, like firms come and brief you, right, as a counsel. So they say that once you build up your reputation there, then you can go and join a senior counsel, and then you get your junior briefs from them. On the other hand, I've heard from another set, like some counsels say that no, it's better to just go and start under a counsel if like you can afford that monetarily. So,
see, I would suggest, see, I'll tell you the pros and cons of starting with a firm. Obviously, the major pro is your financial security. You're going to be paid much better during that period of lull where you don't have too much of work. But one thing that you shouldn't get into is the comfort of doing pure solicitor work, because there you are outsourcing your decision making. In most firms would brief a counsel on every matter. So you would have a senior counsel, in many cases a junior counsel, you have a partner of the law firm, you have a senior associate, and under that you. So you are at the 5th level of decision making, where even at the partner level, major decisions don't get made. So your ability to take a firm decision would perhaps be compromised if you spend too much time doing pure solicitor work. That is the main negative behind joining a firm. Secondly, the pay packages of, when you look at the billing of a firm, Their models are very different from the boutique dispute resolution firms that are today quite a plenty in number. When you look at the big firms, they look at, well, they may have 3 or 4 cases, and they'll bill very heavily. Those will be cases for the big banks from London, or it'll be a Morgan Stanley, one of the really big banks who will perhaps pay them extremely heavily. So the focus is more on that. So you will not get that kind of variety as well. Whereas if you join a boutique firm, you will be handling 8-9 cases a day, and you will get that variety which will help you broaden your horizon. Obviously the pay package of a boutique law firm will not be the same as compared to a really big law firm. Problem about joining a senior counsel straight away is that you will not get to do any drafting work. You will already have a draft, and then the senior counsel will vet the draft, so you really won't learn drafting. So if you're looking at Delhi, Bombay, your main issue is that a lot of the cream commercial work is with a lot of these big firms. So you have to look at a boutique firm that still gets that still gets good commercial work. If you look at cities like Chennai or Hyderabad or Bangalore, the big firms have really not made inroads into the litigation space. So there you see a lot more of lot more boutique firms where you will get a far wider exposure to drafting and to decision making. And I think that's the kind of place that you must join.
Hi, I'm Ashwin from the 3rd year. And my question is a bit more general in that how do you make a decision as to which field in litigation perhaps that you wish to pursue? Like you clearly gravitated towards commercial, but there is of course the other side of doing constitutional purely or civil work purely. And I think you had mentioned previously that you had trouble securing pro bono work yourself. So how do you take this decision? How do you take that step forward?
See, in terms of constitutional, it is easy. You can't build a constitutional law practice. It has to build on its own. So when you become a leading senior, you will get constitutional law work. I don't think that you can build a constitutional law practice, and merely because you are a junior with a senior who has been doing constitutional law work, it doesn't mean governments are going to come to you or key constitutional issues are going to come to you. So pure civil, yes, that's an area which is there, but I think when you look at today, I think there's far more commercial litigation than civil, but you have areas like the criminal litigation which are evergreen, you have tax which is evergreen, so that is purely interest driven. Yeah, the pro bono thing is an issue. You try and get it, but once people associate you with a particular field, you get more and more of that, and you don't get the kind of work that you want. So so you will have to settle with doing work for free for people who can't afford it. But that will be once you are into this space, that will be rare, because most of them will be only businessmen who come to you. But I think you must do varied internships, and maybe even when you start, a year or two here or there doesn't make a difference. So if you start with commercial, you feel, well, this is not your field, try out tax for a year. Feel that's not your field, try out criminal for a year. That will actually help broaden your horizons, because especially criminal and commercial, the combination would help, because there is a lot of there is a criminal angle to a lot of these cases, fraud and commercial fraud and all of that. So I think you must give yourself enough of a time period. You may hit on your area of interest straight away, you may not be so lucky. Give yourself that time period of 2 to 3 years within which you can decide what you want to do. And feel free to be frank with your whoever you join. Speak to your partner, speak to your boss, tell them these are the kinds of things I'm interested in doing. I'm sure they'll help you do that kind of work.
Hello, sir. I had a question. My name is Satvik. I had 2 questions actually. First question was, what are the ideal sort of attributes you're looking in a senior when you what are you looking for in a senior when you join under him, and what are you trying to take away, and how do you when do you know to transition that into practice? And number two is, would it be better to start out in my hometown? I'm from Bangalore. Would it be better to start from there, or would I be better off starting off in Delhi or Bombay?
Yeah. So when you're looking at a place to join, I think what you must essentially look at is, do they have a lot of drafting work initially? Because that's the first skill that you need to try and pick up. You're not going to, if you're looking at commercial dispute resolution, you're not going to sit and argue from day one, because stakes are usually high. So you look at drafting work, you need to ensure that you are busy, that people in that office are really, really busy. They have more than they can handle. It's only then will you get your opportunities easily. It's only then will the senior not turn up on a few occasions. If you go to an office where there are 3 cases going on at a time, and then the senior is going to turn up for all the 3, or in all probability they would have engaged a senior counsel for those 3, because those 3 must be fairly big cases. So you join a place where there is more work than the people there can handle, and where you get some level of variety. Then what is the best time to start your practice? I don't think you must have a fixed period in your mind. You must, when you join, request your senior upfront that if I do have my own cases, how do I handle it? So as a matter of rule, anybody who joins me, I tell them on day 1, if you get your own case, you can decide how you want to handle it. You handle the whole thing on your own, you keep the fee, you just pay the expenses, whatever, 10% to the office expenses account, the rest of it is yours. You engage the firm to handle it because you think that contact of yours would rather give the firm the brief than you individually. Then you have a fee split between the firm and you. You otherwise handle it on your own. You want me to come and appear for select hearings, I will appear as a senior, and again there will be a fee sharing arrangement. So in that sense, you will be able to do your own work as well. You will be able to generate your own clientele even when you are still a junior. That's exactly what I did. And there will be a stage when you get so busy that you will be spending more time doing your own work than the office work. That's the time to move on. And then you asked about your hometown. See, I am quite in favor of starting in a place like Bangalore, because, as I said, it's where you will get a lot more opportunities, because the big firms are really not entrenched fully into the commercial dispute resolution space. But that's the main advantage. But if you look at the disadvantage, if you join a court which has original jurisdiction, you have a lot more opportunities at the high court level, which is where obviously the standard is higher. So in Bangalore, all your commercial suits would be before the city civil court, and 50% of them may move to the high court. But by that time, a lot of the heat is off, except in a few cases. So that's one issue of starting. So therefore, in that sense, well, you may want to look at Delhi. That may be the.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Chit Krishna from the second year. So my question was that if you do transactional work for, let's say, a brief period, are there any skills that you specifically learn while doing that might help you in litigation?
Well, I think perfection in the draft is one thing. Perfection in the draft certainly is one thing. In fact, there's one point I wanted to mention about how even if you want to be a transactional lawyer, it helps to have some litigation background. Because without that, you will not know how your agreement is going to be interpreted tomorrow. If you look at it from, oh, okay, I can twist this clause in this manner and file a case for breach, then you will be more alert when you draft the clause in that manner. I can give you an example. There was I don't want to name the firm, but one of the bigger firms in India, Bombay-based firm, had directly copied an English firm's template in relation to a bond issue. The template, however, was meant for an instrument where you have 1,000 bonds that are issued and you have subscribers from across the world, and therefore you require a trustee to hold all those bonds in trust. So you have 3 or 4 different agreements. Except that this was a case where there was one single bond being issued to one party and they had directly copied the template. So much so that there were 4 different agreements for this one single bond issue. And each agreement was between the same 2 parties, and each agreement contained a different dispute resolution clause. So ultimately it was great fun for us as lawyers because we could play around with it. But when you look at it from the client's point of view, they went through a lot of unnecessary litigation because of that. So I would, therefore, if a transaction lawyer has a litigation background, it helps. For a litigation lawyer, if you're as a transaction lawyer, you may get to read SEBI and FEMA and all of that in some level of detail, which may help you if you want to do securities litigation. It may also help in the thoroughness of drafting, because there is a lot of focus on the thoroughness of drafting, but you can get the thoroughness of drafting elsewhere as well. So I wouldn't think that if you know you want to be a litigation lawyer, I wouldn't advise you to go and do transactional work for 2 years.
So my name is Vishal. I'm from the second year. I wanted to know if there's any scope for litigation specifically in the field of technology law in India.
I think it's too super specialized at this stage. There is some technology law work, but to say you want to do only litigation and only in technology law, I think technology law, both transactional and litigation mix is fine. But purely for litigation and technology law, there's not as much work. Maybe there will be in the future with these data encryption laws and all that being formulated now with a new policy. But yeah, in IPR as such, there's a lot of work. You can specialize, but within IPR to say only technology, I think maybe if you're interested, I can put you on to Rohan George, who's also from Nalsar, who is a partner at Samvad Partners, who specializes in technology law. He does some general IPR as well, but that's his objective is to be a pure technology law specialist.
Yeah. I have 2 questions. Firstly, mostly with respect to the Madras bar and the Bangalore bar, how important is it for me to know the language of the state, and will I be able to do as well as I could in perhaps arbitration, or maybe even in Delhi or Bombay if I'm more comfortable with Hindi? And secondly, completely unrelated to this, if I were to commit to international arbitration fully and aim to work at a firm like 3 Crowns, would I be crossing the Rubicon, or could I turn back at a later point?
Very interesting question. The first one, I don't think language is a barrier for commercial dispute resolution. For instance, I can speak Tamil, but I can't read and write Tamil very fluently. So we'll give you this thing. Maybe till date, there are 3 cases where I would have had to read out passages from Tamil. Till date, that is in so many years, where I would get some junior of mine who knows Tamil to read it out in court. You can always avoid those briefs. You would require Tamil if you're interested in doing appellate side work, where you handle appeals coming from district courts across the state. The city civil court, you can insist on cross-examination in English. So it's okay.
But wouldn't that affect the quality of the cross-examination if your witness is more comfortable in the vernacular?
Usually the comfort is not of the witness but of the judge. The witnesses are, well, in a commercial matter, you would expect the witness to know.
Because I was in a domestic arbitration a couple of weeks ago, which was in English, and it was a commercial matter, but the witness was unable to understand English very fluently, or perhaps he was pretending to. He seemed like a slightly I couldn't use that word. So the counsel on my side had to shift to Kannada, and then I could not understand what was happening. So that made me realize that perhaps...
No, I don't think I handle a fair amount of... Well, I can't say I handle too much of trial work at the City Civil Court in Karnataka, but I handle a fair amount of arbitration work in Karnataka. I don't know a word of Kannada, and I've had no issue. So, similarly, in Tamil Nadu, I have never had, well, for that matter anywhere else, I have never had a situation where the witness did not know there was only one situation where the witness knew Hindi. There was somebody else. My Hindi is, I can manage. I can understand what he's saying. So he can't just say something else and get away. But I was not, obviously I couldn't cross-examine in Hindi. So I would ask my question in English. Somebody would translate. The problem there was that the arbitrator did not know Hindi. So that's where the issue came. That was only a one-off situation. I'm going to have this for the first time 10 days from now, because we're doing an arbitration in Malaysia, and the witness is from Korea, and he's given his witness statement in Korean and somebody's translated it into English. The statement says he knows no word, he doesn't even know English, so now I need to... there you have the school systems, where they give you headphones, so you ask your question in English, it gets automatically translated to Korean, he gives his answer in Korean, it gets automatically translated to English, and you have two languages in your headset. You can either switch on English or Korean and follow the cross-examination. So, but that's going to be the first time I'm cross-examining a witness who knows, where the witness and I don't speak the same language. That's not a issue.
Second question?
The second, it's a little subjective. I don't think it's about super specialization and turning back after you super specialize. I think it's about getting too used to a system of orderliness. Because in here you will come across shady lawyers on the other side who will try and pull a fast one, which you will not, once you get to, say, if you spend 5 years, and I've seen people like that who spent 5-6 years in a firm, who then come to India and can't, a foreign firm, super specializing, then come to India and they can't adapt. You need to know, litigation in India is extremely dynamic. You need to be able to think on your feet. You need to know, okay, if let me give you a simple example. In a number of courts, if you should know that you need to get a date fixed. If you don't get a date fixed, the clerk of the other side will go and hide the bundle in the registry. These kind of tricks you will not really know if you're used to a system with such great order. These are things that you learn on the go. When you've had that situation once, you'll realize how bad the situation is. And then you should know, okay, with whom it's possible, with whom it's not. So you need to be able to think on your feet for which you need to get to know the system. But I think the other way is always possible. You start off by knowing, by doing a lot of commercial dispute resolution, and at some point say, well, I now have enough arbitration work, I'm going to do only arbitration. That I think would be a better way up than the reverse.
I think that's all the questions we have time for today. So thank you for your encouraging and enlightening talk.
My pleasure. Thank you. If anybody has any other questions, you can meet me outside because I'm here for another half an hour or so. I'll possibly be leaving by 7:30. So anybody has any other questions, you can always catch me.
The Nyaya Forum is extremely grateful for you sharing your time and thoughts with us. And also thank you to all of you for coming down. I know it's been a long day of classes.